Top 10 Problems with Dominic Mancini. Welcome to another My Top 10, and this time we're going to talk about Dominic Mancini's account of the events in England in 1483. It's a source that offers a rare, contemporary account of what happened in 1483, but which is also riddled with problems. So let's dive in to my top 10 problems with Dominic Mancini. Number 1. The current translation. The text of Mancini in English that is used most widely at the moment is the translation by C.A.J. Armstrong, completed in 1969. And for me, this translation in itself is riddled with problems, not least the title. The original title of Mancini's work reads De Occupatione Regni Angli, blah blah blah. That Latin is always translated as the usurpation of Richard III, to give it that dark element of a usurpation, whereas De Occupatione in fact refers to the occupation of the throne by Richard III, without the kind of emotive language being applied to the nature of his acquisition of the throne. In his introduction to the story, Mancini also talks about Richard as Duke of Gloucester being appointed protector of the realm by Edward IV in his will, and the translation goes on to tell us, men say that in the same will he appointed as protector of his children and realm his brother Richard Duke of Gloucester, who shortly after destroyed Edward's children and then claimed the throne for himself. In the original Latin, the word used by Mancini is oppressis, which means to oppress. So whilst it does say that Richard oppressed Edward's children, again we get a more emotive use of the word destroyed in the translation by Armstrong. So I think the current translation of Mancini has real problems in that it's leaning towards a dark interpretation of the events of 1483 that perhaps a new version of the translation might help to eradicate and mollify. Number 2, Angelo CATO. Mancini also tells us that he's writing his account at the request of Angelo CATO, the Archbishop of Vienne. Although Angelo CATO is an Italian, like Mancini, he'd been working at the French court and had been a personal physician to Louis XI for many years, and this means that he was effectively on the French side of events in 1483. And in 1483, England and France were, once more as they were for much of the medieval period, on the brink of war with each other. Mancini writes of Cato, "You have often besought me, Angelo Cato, most reverend father in God, to put in writing by what machinations Richard III, who is now reigning in England, attained the high degree of kingship, a story which I have repeatedly gone over in your presence." So Mancini is being told to write these things down by Angelo Cato. And my suspicion would be that the Angelo Cato intended this to serve a French agenda. And that would be to darken the reputation of Richard III and thus do away with the potential threat that he was about to open a new chapter in the 100 Years' War with France. Number 3, Mancini speaks no English. Dominic Mancini was an Italian, and he doesn't make much of a secret of the fact that he didn't speak any English at all. Most of his sources seem to have been from amongst Italian merchants in London, and that's a community who had a particular disregard for Richard. His Parliament of 1484, for example, would go on to uniquely punish Italian merchants, way beyond other foreign merchants. So there seems to be no love lost between the Italian community and Richard. The other sources that Mancini speaks to seem to be largely from the Woodville faction, and their agenda, again, is at odds with that of Richard. They want to paint themselves as the victims because they've effectively lost in 1483. So I think we have to be very, very wary of who Mancini is speaking to and of his grasp of the language and what he's hearing and his ability to transmit that to his audience effectively. Number 4, Mancini admits he doesn't know anything. Startlingly, Mancini caveats his account of 1483 with an explanation of the fact that he doesn't really know what happened and what went on, and that he's wary of writing it down for Angelo Cato. Mancini tells us, "I indeed decided that I ought not to expatiate so freely in writing as in talking, for although on your account I did not shrink from pains, yet I had not sufficiently ascertained the names of those to be described, the intervals of time, and the secret designs of men in this whole affair. Therefore, as you press me with unusual urgency in your desire to please the illustrious prince to whom you are so much indebted, so shall I exceed the bounds of modesty in avoiding the imputation of ingratitude, and shall be more concerned to please you than to be remembered as a pattern for authors. Wherefore you should not expect from me the names of individual men and places, nor that this account should be complete in all its details. Rather shall it resemble the effigy of a man, which lacks some of the limbs, and yet the beholder delineates for himself a man's form. Mancini is caveating what he's about to tell us by explaining that he doesn't really understand the full facts of what happened. He can't vouch for his sources, he doesn't know names, he was listening to rumours on the streets of London. But Angelo CATO is clearly very keen for Mancini to tell the story, to get it written down, and to make it widely available. And that, I think, is explained by the unusual urgency that Mancini speaks of in Cato's desire to paint a dark picture of Richard for the benefit of the French court, because war was about to erupt between the two nations. So before we rely too heavily on Mancini, we ought to be wary, because he himself tells us that he can't vouch for an awful lot of what he's going to say. Number 5. Mancini believes in a feud between Richard and the Woodvilles. During his description of 1483, Mancini offers some background, which he can only possibly have picked up from Woodville faction, from Italian merchants, and from gossip on the streets of London. As part of that, he tells us, it seems that in claiming the throne, Richard was actuated not only by ambition and lust for power, but he also proclaimed that he was harassed by the ignoble family of the Queen and the affronts of Edward's relatives by marriage. He also goes on to explain that Edward had overseen the execution of their brother, George, Duke of Clarence, and that Richard had been incredibly unhappy and had held a grudge ever since. At that time, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was so overcome with grief for his brother that he could not dissimulate so well, but that he was overheard to say that he would one day avenge his brother's death. The implication is clear. Mancini wants us to believe that there was a big long-running feud between Richard and the Woodvilles, that Richard blamed the Queen and her family for the death of his brother George. But there's simply no other contemporary evidence to support that view. It's probably the application of hindsight in 1483, and again, Mancini can only be relying on rumours and stories that he's hearing on the streets of London. In fact, there seems to be no feud at all between Richard and the Woodvilles right up to April 1483. We know that in the early months of 1483, before Edward IV's death, Anthony Woodville had submitted a land dispute to Richard's arbitration because he trusted him so completely to find the correct result. The Woodvilles and Richard had worked side by side on commissions in the upbringing of the future Edward V when he was Prince of Wales. So there is no long-running feud between Richard and the Woodvilles. And again, if Mancini relies on this because he's listening to gossip, then it must bring into question the other things that he's able to tell us. Number 6. Mancini mentions incidents that no one else does. Part of the story of 1483 has long been that Richard does his best to do away with the Woodville prisoners that he takes at Stony Stratford. So he tries to get council to execute Anthony Woodville Earl Rivers, and Sir Richard Grey, who is the Queen's second son from her first marriage, so a half-brother to the princes in the Tower. But Mancini is in fact the only source who ever makes reference to this attempt. Mancini tells us, accordingly, he attempted to bring about the condemnation of those whom he had put into prison by obtaining a decision of the council convicting them of preparing ambushes and of being guilty of treason itself. No other contemporary source, including the Crowland Chronicle, mentions this attempt by Richard in council to have these men executed, and it's clearly trying to paint a picture of Richard as a man keen to eliminate his enemies. Mancini also goes on to claim that no act against Richard could have possibly been anything approaching treason because Richard didn't hold any national offices, ignoring the fact that he had been Constable and Admiral of England for well over a decade by this point, and did hold plenty of national offices. So again, it exposes Mancini's lack of understanding of English politics and of the personalities involved. Number 7. Dr. Argentine's testimony. One of the few people that Mancini names amongst his sources is Dr. John Argentine, who had been a physician to Edward V and who would go on to become a physician in the Tudor court to Prince Arthur Tudor. Dr. Argentine is therefore closely associated with the Woodville faction during the events of 1483, and he would end up in the continent as part of Henry Tudor's entourage before he invaded and became King Henry VII. So we have to question the reliability of what Dr. Argentine says, and he's quite often cited in pointing to the fact that the princes in the Tower believed that they were about to be murdered. Mancini tells us of this doctor's relationship with King Edward V. The physician Argentine, the last of his attendants whose service the king enjoyed, reported that the young king, like a victim, prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. Many commentators will tell us this is a clear sign that Edward V feared that he was about to be killed by his uncle Richard. But this overlooks two fairly important aspects. Edward V could have been ill. He was being attended by a physician, although amongst medieval royalty that was perhaps nothing at all unusual. It was a day-to-day occurrence to be visited by a physician. But it also overlooks the fact that Dr. Argentine, in talking about Edward V giving confession and preparing like a victim for sacrifice, ignores completely the fate of Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. He doesn't say that Richard was afraid for his life. So does this imply that Edward was either perhaps older and more able to grasp the situation and the danger that they were in, or that Edward was ill and in fact Richard was safe and they were never really under a threat from Richard at all? Or is this just Dr. Argentine spinning a story to make Richard look bad during 1483? Number 8, the pre-contract story. Edward V and his siblings were declared illegitimate on the basis of the fact that their father, Edward IV, had been married before he married their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and that therefore that second marriage was bigamous and all of the children illegitimate and incapable of succeeding to the throne. When he speaks about the pre-contract story and Edward IV, Mancini tells us, Edward, they say, was conceived in adultery and in every way was unlike the late Duke of York, whose son he was falsely said to be. But Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who altogether resembled his father, was to come to the throne as the legitimate successor. Mancini is the only commentator who points to these sermons being about Edward IV's illegitimacy rather than the illegitimacy of his children, based on a charge of bigamy. Thomas More, as we discussed in the previous top 10, would later pick up this story, but it remains the only contemporary version that includes this accusation. Crowland and others who were around at the time talk about the charge of bigamy and the pre-contract with the Lady Eleanor Butler, but none of them accuse Richard of claiming that Edward IV himself was illegitimate. It's only later, when the Duke of Buckingham makes a speech before the Lords, that suddenly the charge of bigamy is added, because the charge that Edward IV himself was illegitimate was so unpalatable. But it simply isn't true. It's probably that Mancini has picked up rumours, that he's heard there's stories going around about Edward IV's marriage and his legitimacy, and has assumed, because he doesn't speak any English, that this is the story that he's probably picked up in France about Edward IV being illegitimate himself. In fact, the only real accusation that was made in 1483 was that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was bigamous. Number 9. Mancini doesn't know what happened to the princes in the Tower. Mancini's source is often used as evidence that the princes in the Tower were murdered at the command of their uncle King Richard. But what Mancini actually says is that he doesn't know what happened. We know he left England before they were last seen in the Tower of London. And all that Mancini offers on their fate is when he says, I have seen many men burst forth into tears and lamentations when mention was made of him after his removal from men's sight, and already there was a suspicion that he had been done away with. Whether, however, he has been done away with, and by what manner of death, so far I have not at all discovered. Now earlier Mancini had told us that he doesn't really know the truth of what had happened, and he left England before anything definitive had happened to Edward V. Yet he tells us that he's seen men weeping in the belief that Edward V had been put to death already. Again, we have no mention of Richard, Duke of York, Edward V's younger brother. And Mancini is very clear that whether this is true or not, and how it may or may not have happened, he has absolutely no idea of. So we should be very careful in using Mancini's testimony as sure evidence that the princes in the Tower were murdered by Richard. Number 10, the Mad War. One of the key elements in assessing the reliability of any source material is to look at the context in which it was written. When Mancini signs off, he clearly writes at the bottom of his account, concluded at Beaugency in the county of Orléans, 1st of December 1483. Now the date makes it contemporary, and we know that Mancini was in London for the events that he describes, though he didn't have any English, and he didn't have a very clear grasp on English politics. He was also writing for the benefit of the French court. And this is the worrying element at this point. We know that at Beaugency, Guillaume de Rochefort, the French Chancellor, was preparing his speech that he would give at the French Parliament in January 1484, explicitly accusing Richard of murdering his nephews, the princes in the Tower, in order to take the throne. This was French propaganda, and Mancini is part of that machine that is beginning to ramp up pressure against Richard. But it's not just Richard that they fear, they have their own internal problems. Louis XI died within a few months of Edward IV, and he left his own minority crisis behind. His son, King Charles VIII, was just 13 when Louis died. So France was in the grip of its own minority crisis, much as England had been during the summer of 1483. The Duke of Orléans was making his own claim to the French throne to replace Charles VIII. And Guillaume de Rochefort's speech in Parliament was less about actually knowing that Richard had murdered the princes in the Tower, because Mancini makes it clear that he didn't know and nobody else seemed to. What Guillaume de Rochefort is saying is that we don't want to be like those terrible, horrible English over the channel, do we? They murder child kings and end up with a ruthless, murdering tyrant on the throne. So if we allow Charles VIII to be removed by the Duke of Orléans, then we're going to end up in the same boat as the English. And the French actually move into a period of civil war, known as the Mad War, between 1485 and 1488, when the Duke of Orléans openly claimed the French throne in place of Charles VIII. So we have to place what Mancini is saying in that context. He's writing for a French audience to try and make a political point that has far more to do with the circumstances in France in 1483 and 1484 than it really does with the political situation in England. So all in all, I think we have to be very, very careful about how we use Mancini's source for the events of 1483. Undoubtedly, an eyewitness is of vital importance to us. And I think perhaps the best description that we can offer of Mancini is that he's an honest reporter of the things that he saw in London in 1483. He can't vouch for the truth of anything that he says. He can't vouch for his understanding of it because he doesn't speak English, and he's not able to disclose who his sources are. And that ought to make us just a little bit wary of how we use his information. So whilst we shouldn't write off his testimony, we should take it with a pinch of salt.